July 1977, July 9th letter kept hidden from devotees and the severe consequences of this. Here I will share the evidence that Rameshwar did not actually send the July 9th letter to the temple presidents, and I will examine why he didn't, as well as seeing the severe consequences of having not sent this letter out. Generally, my intention is to just present the facts and stay away from speculating what could have been. However, on some things, not all evidence is available to me. So I've had to speculate here and there as to what seems the most likely scenario based on the evidence I do have, based on logical analysis and the surrounding events, etc. And those times I've had to speculate, I have tried to be open and upfront about it and letting you know when I am quoting, provable evidence or when I'm making an educated guess about something. I try to be as careful as I can to not make any false accusations, but on the other hand, I consider it important to have a full overview of what took place. The fact is, all the circumstantial evidence that I found, which I will give shortly, is that this letter was not mailed out. There were severe consequences and ramifications because of this. This needs to be understood in order to really understand what took place and why. But at the same time, as I said, I have to be careful not to make false accusations. The best way I know to do this is to give my best educated guess as to what happened based on the evidence we have, and yet let everyone know that the following is my best guess. It is based on circumstantial evidence. I also did this regarding Srila Prabhupada having discussed with Tamal before the May 28th meeting his plan to set up a Ritvik system for initiations after he departs. There is no recording of that discussion that we can point to as solid evidence that this did take place. However, all surrounding evidence points only to that conclusion. We have Gauridas Pandit's word, and as he was present in those meetings, Tamal Krishna himself has admitted this at one time, that Prabhupada spoke about this before the meeting. And we have the peculiar nature, most peculiar nature of the GBC's questions that they asked Srila Prabhupada and his responses. None of their questions or Srila Prabhupada's response or their response to Srila Prabhupada's response makes any sense at all if he had not talked about setting up a Ritvik system prior to the May 28th meeting. All of this becomes overwhelmingly compelling evidence, and as such, for the rest of the analysis of the meeting and onward, I have presented it as an actual fact, at least for the purpose of making our case and for the rest of the presentation, making the presentation go smoothly. And here I'm going to be doing the same thing. Regarding the July 9th letter, as to whether or not it was actually mailed out to the temple presidents in July of 1977, even any time after that date for that matter, except for the July 21st letter that Rameshwar sent to the GBC members saying he was about to send it to temple presidents, all other evidence points to the fact that he didn't do this. Therefore, for the purpose of trying to present a comprehensive view of this issue and what really took place, I am taking this to be a fact. The copies of that letter were not mailed out to the temple presidents. However, whether it was mailed out in July of 1977 to the presidents or not doesn't affect the other arguments we're making. It doesn't weaken our case at all. None of our other arguments are based on whether or not the temple presidents got this letter at that time or not. But now, and so why am I doing it? Well, because it does make a difference to understand the entire circumstance, the entire situation that was going on. Now, as to the evidence that I say points to this conclusion, that it wasn't mailed out, well, first, I will admit that I've only talked to just a couple of, basically two devotees, myself, who I knew were temple presidents at the time. And the fact is, neither of them had any memory of having received it, including one of them who was an adamant supporter, at the time when I asked him, he was an adamant supporter of the GBC side on this issue, and he held very strong views against the Ritvik Ras side. He admitted, though, that even as of 2009, when I spoke to him, that even by that date, he had still never read the July 9th letter. And he even referred to that letter, a letter that was requested by His Divine Grace, a letter that Srila Prabhupada signed and gave his full approval to, a letter that he spent many days, dictating. And he actually referred to that letter, the July 9th letter, as Ritvik poison. And just see how poisoned he was by the GBC's constant bashing of the Ritvik representative path, that a senior devotee would actually refer to one of Srila Prabhupada's letter as a poison. Yet he even admitted that he had not got the letter in 1977. He said he definitely would have remembered it and would have shared it with the other temple devotees at his temple. Another devotee, who was temple president at the time, told me the same thing. If he had gotten it, he would have shared it with the devotees at the temple, and he assured me he had never gotten it. Also, over the last 2 decades, I have read some articles at various times by a few other temple presidents saying that they never received the letter. So on the other side, I have never seen or heard any devotee who was temple president at the time say they had received it. Secondly, Srila Prabhupada's condition was very bad and getting worse by the day. If not in July, by late August or September, as more and more devotees came to the sad realization that Srila Prabhupada would not remain with us much longer, many of the devotees would have been concerned with who the next guru will be. All of us were concerned how things will go on after Srila Prabhupada leaves. This letter was the only letter or document that was signed by Srila Prabhupada regarding the topic of initiations. And the letter states that the 11 men would be Ritviks and that Srila Prabhupada would remain the actual initiating guru. The word henceforward is used, indicating that this was to be the system henceforward, from now on. If a temple president would have received this letter in July, or at least, and he had it in July, and then at least in July, maybe August, by September, there is no doubt that they would have been wondering if this Ritvik system was the system that Srila Prabhupada wanted for after his disappearance. That would have most certainly been the conclusion reached by a number of temple presidents had they got this letter at that time. And by many other devotees, that because they would have shared this letter with all the devotees at their temples. So many devotees would have had that, would have wondered if that was if this letter did not represent what Srila Prabhupada wanted for after he was no longer present. Again, it is most absolutely certain that the temple presidents would have then brought this up to their local GBC and asked them, if this were the system, once Srila Prabhupada leaves, is this the system that we will follow? Especially the temple presidents who were in the zones of one of those 11 who were named in the letter. By the end of the month, the GBC will have reached the conclusion that this letter was only to apply while Prabhupada was present. And the GBC concluded that the 11 men named here would then become actual gurus on Prabhupada's disappearance. The GBC reached that conclusion at least by the end of July. I will get to that shortly. With that understanding by the GBC, and with the understanding that had this letter been mailed out to the temple presidents, and certainly, most certainly, some of the temple presidents would have been asking their local GBC if this system described in this letter is what Prabhupada wants for after he leaves, then their local GBC member would have informed them no, as they would have then had to explain what the GBC felt was the actual system. And they would say no, that when Prabhupada met with the GBC met with Srila Prabhupada in May, he had given a verbal instruction. He had said that these Ritviks were to become actual gurus upon his disappearance. Believe me, a number of temple presidents, while they respected the GBC, they also knew that these men were not qualified to become actual guru. They were not on the Mahabhagavat platform. The temple presidents were as much aware as that. As well, recall that just a few months earlier, toward the end of April, the Tamal Krishna himself had that same exact understanding. As he told Srila Prabhupada, he knew he wasn't qualified. And then he said he told Srila Prabhupada he had assessed all of Prabhupada's disciples, and he told Srila Prabhupada, none of them were qualified. That was Tamal's own assessment of himself and the others. The temple presidents would have had that same assessment. They would have had that same understanding. The point is, if this letter had been mailed out, the temple presidents would have most certainly have brought this topic up of initiations after Prabhupada leaves, and that would have basically led the GBC to inform those temple presidents that these men were to become Srila Prabhupada's successors. They would have become the actual gurus, regular gurus after he departs. Since that isn't stated in the letter, then this would have led a number of temple presidents to then ask the GBC, actually demand the GBC to go back to Srila Prabhupada and ask him to confirm that this is what he wanted in a written statement with his signature. The fact is, none of this took place. The fact that there is absolutely no record, no article written about this, no evidence. No one has ever written an article saying that a temple president saying, oh, I got the July 9th letter and I was wondering if this was the system and I had this conversation with my GBC. Nobody has ever come forward and stated these things. And there's just no evidence at all that any temple president ever had this discussion with their GBC. It's just no evidence that they have ever gotten this letter. For me, this is alone solid proof enough that the letter was not mailed out to the temple presidents as it was supposed to have been. There is absolutely no doubt that these conversations would have taken place if the temple presidents had received this letter. In March of 1978, the GBC wrote and distributed an official paper that dealt with initiations now that Srila Prabhupada was no longer with us. That paper gave the names of 11 new acharyas, and it mentioned the list where Srila Prabhupada had given the names of those 11. Bhardraj is a senior disciple of Srila Prabhupada, and he told me that he had asked Rameshwar, who was our GBC in LA, if he could see the list for himself. He just wanted to verify for himself that it was valid, that Srila Prabhupada had signed the list, that it came from Srila Prabhupada. Rameshwar denied Bhardraj's request, who was even more senior a devotee than Rameshwar was himself. He told Bhardraj that the list or letter was only for GBC members. Rameshwar told him that Srila Prabhupada had given the GBC verbal instructions when they met with him earlier, and those instructions weren't given in the list, only part of it was. And that if devotees read that list, they'll reach the wrong understanding. For that reason, the GBC would not let other devotees see it. He told Bhardraj that he would just have to trust the GBC. Trust? Trust is when your leaders don't keep such important instructions given by your own spiritual master away from you. Trust is when your leaders act in such a way that you know you can trust them. Trust Rameshwar? Trust the GBC? As I told in my personal story, and we'll cover later in the timeline segment, we had just discovered that after Prabhupada left, that Rameshwar and the other leading members of the GBC had just lied to all of us, to all of Prabhupada's disciples, about Srila Prabhupada's request for all of us to come to be with him in Vrindavan. After being caught lying like this, now we find out that now they're telling us that Prabhupada had appointed them to be gurus, and that they're withholding important instructions given by Srila Prabhupada about them becoming gurus. And Rameshwar is just saying, well, we'll just have to trust them. The real question was, why didn't he and the other GBC members trust us? We're Prabhupada's disciples. Why didn't they trust that we could understand what Prabhupada had said, at least as much as they could? Why weren't they open with this information and sharing all the information with us? They didn't trust us. the point I was trying to make is that it's an undisputed fact that the GBC banned access to this letter from the rank and file members, most definitely after Srila Prabhupada's disappearance. And the only way that could have been so effective is that they hadn't mailed this letter out to the temple presidents, because if they had, the temple presidents would have been sharing this letter with the rest of us. And we didn't have it. And once the GBC had rolled out the 11 new acharyas and their multi-guru system, and that letter had actually been, if that letter had actually been mailed out to all the temple presidents would have immediately had issue, even in March of 1978, and made their issues known, because the GBC were saying in their official paper that Srila Prabhupada had ordered these men to become actual gurus. But of course, the July 9th letter doesn't state that. He only appointed them to become Ritviks. Obviously, the temple presidents would have brought this whole issue up early in 1978. But again, none of this occurred. And the only reason it hadn't is because this letter was never mailed to the temple presidents in July. Other evidence that the temple presidents never received the letter is that during the Zonal Acharya years, many insane things were going on, and temple presidents were becoming more and more fed up with the whole farce. They were demanding the GBC reel in the gurus who had become, like tyrannical dictators in their zones, and worse even. Many of them were falling down and committing sinful activities, and they were still being worshipped in the temples as pure devotees. If the temple presidents would have had access to the July 9th letter, and during those times, they would have made the point that in that letter, Srila Prabhupada had only named them to become Ritviks and not gurus. That argument was never made until later, in the mid-1980s, when copies of this letter, along with Srila Prabhupada's other letters, were clandestinely smuggled out from the BBT archives, and copies were slowly passed around to other devotees. So it wasn't until devotees finally got access to this letter did those arguments begin to form, because they were based on this letter. Prabhupada had only named them to be Ritviks. The obvious point being that if the letter had been mailed out, these arguments would have been made while Srila Prabhupada was still present, and not 10 years after he departed. All of this evidence, direct and circumstantial, points to one conclusion in this regard, and that is that this letter had not been mailed out to the temple presidents in July of 1977. For all these reasons, and from now on in the presentation, I am stating that as an actual fact. So why make such a big deal about this? Because we have to have a full grasp of this issue, and one needs to know all the related events and circumstances that form the decisions on both sides of this issue. If the GBC had chosen to not send the letter out, as I said, all evidence points to that fact, and that is the stand I'm going to be taking, or am taking, then why didn't they? On July 21st, Rameshwar wrote to the other GBC members and told them that he was about to send the letter out to the temple presidents, yet all evidence shows he never did. I have no way of knowing if the original decision to not send it out was Rameshwar's alone, or if other GBC members contacted him and convinced him not to do so. It doesn't really matter who, but to me it makes more sense that it was Rameshwar's decision, because this sounds a lot like what took place in Prabhupada's last month with us. If you have already watched my personal story, you will remember that Rameshwar told me that it was his original idea to keep devotees from hearing Prabhupada's request when he asked that all disciples come and be by his side. If you haven't watched that yet, you need to. Click on the link, tap on the link, whatever. And I will also cover this when we get to the appropriate timelines in October and November, but not as in much detail as I did in my personal story. But because I want to highlight the similarities between the decision to keep the July 9th away from the rank and file devotees and that incident that took place between October to November, I will give brief highlights here. In mid-October, His Divine Grace made a humble loving request and asked that all his disciples come to Vrindavan to be with him. Rameshwar was convinced that this request by Srila Prabhupada would have wound up totally destroying ISKCON. And so he decided he had to take action in order to, in his own words to me, what he said, save ISKCON. Yes, to save ISKCON from none other than Srila Prabhupada. The reason for his decision and actions was that he had seen some Sankirtan book distributors. 2 of them showed up in Vrindavan. And because in a few months the Christmas marathons would start, he was concerned that if all the book distributors came, if they left their temples and they came to Vrindavan just to be with Prabhupada, that the temples wouldn't have the money, the income to pay their mortgage payments, and all the temples would be foreclosed on by the banks. He had already come to this conclusion. And so he had already come to the conclusion that he had to do something to keep devotees from leaving the temples and coming to be with Srila Prabhupada. He reached that conclusion before he learned of Srila Prabhupada's request. The next day or so, when he learned that Srila Prabhupada requested, he wanted all his disciples to come, Rameshwar's mind had already been made up that this could destroy the movement if the book distributors all left their services. So he considered this request by Srila Prabhupada to be just a really, really bad. He already feared the temples could be lost if all these Sankirtan devotees came, and now he thought, if the devotees hear Srila Prabhupada's request, then for certain this would destroy ISKCON. He became so convinced that Prabhupada's request was so bad that he decided he had to do whatever it took to, in his own words, save ISKCON. One reason I know what he was thinking and what happened is that shortly after Srila Prabhupada departed this world, Rameshwar actually sat down with me and told me everything. How that came about and how it came about, when he saw the Sankirtan devotees, he revealed all of this. And he revealed to me his thinking, his rationalization process. I explain all that in my personal story. So Rameshwar told me that he knew most devotees wouldn't listen to him if it was just him asking everyone not to go to India. So he decided the only way he could convince everyone not to come was by lying to us, by telling everyone that it was Srila Prabhupada who requested that we not come. That was just the total opposite of what Srila Prabhupada had requested. In the October timelines coming up in this chronological timeline section, I will give the evidence that proves that this did in fact take place. And that evidence shows that this whole thing of keeping devotees from coming to be with Srila Prabhupada, that it made Srila Prabhupada sad in his last days with us. When someone makes such bad decisions as this, as Rameshwar and the other GBC men, because it wasn't just Rameshwar's, he said it was his original idea. He discussed it with Tamal Krishna, who approved the idea. They met with other GBC men because they knew it had to be coordinated with other GBC. So it was a number of GBC men who agreed to Rameshwar's original idea. And when someone makes such bad decisions like this and uses such convoluted rationalization to take offensive actions against their own spiritual master, to lie using his name, to lie to all the devotees en masse all around the world. He was lying to all the temple presidents, telling them make sure the devotees don't go to be with Prabhupada. When somebody does this, thinks like this, takes this rationalization, and that mentality and mindset and such rationalization and thinking wouldn't all come together for just one incident. Rather, that mentality would have been present for some time and would have influenced these men to make other similar blunderous decisions as well. And it is for this reason that since the July 9th letter was in Rameshwar's hands as of in July of 21st, and he was possibly within just hours of mailing it out to the temple presidents, Because of the similarities, I'm thinking that it was most likely Rameshwar who came up with the idea first that this letter should not be sent out. And years later, in 1984, when I found out that all of Srila Prabhupada's letters had been banned, Rajendranath, who was the manager of the BBT, and this I'll put in the timeline in 1984, I'll just mention it, but Rajendranath was the manager of the BBT at the time. I think I actually put it in my personal story. And he told me at that time, in 1984, that it was Rameshwar's original idea to ban all of Srila Prabhupada's letters from the devotees. Rajendranath told me that Rameshwar then met with Tamal Krishna, and Tamal Krishna agreed, and they presented it to the rest of the GBC, and they agreed. So the same pattern. Rameshwar has an idea, he talks it over with Tamal, and Tamal agrees, and then they meet with the rest of the GBC, and that becomes the plan. So why did Rameshwar want all of Prabhupada's letters banned? Well, according to Rajendranath in 1984, he told me that Rameshwar had told him that basically the same thing that Rameshwar had told Bharadwaj in 1978, which I will also mention in the appropriate timeline. And that is that there were some letters by Srila Prabhupada that only gave part of the instructions, and that the other part he had given verbally to the GBC. So Rameshwar's argument why all the letters should be banned was because, if devotees only read the letters, they will reach the wrong conclusions because they won't know the other part of the instructions he had given verbally. And the devotees will think the GBC are not managing the movement properly. And then they'll rebel against the GBC and the movement would fall apart. That was basically what Rameshwar had told Bharadwaj in 1978. It's what Rajendranath then told me in 1984, why Rameshwar and what Rameshwar had told him and why the letters were being banned. So I have put all that together to reach my conclusion that it would most likely have been Rameshwar who decided not to send out the July 9th letter. Rameshwar had become convinced that the July 9th letter would mislead everyone and make us reach the wrong conclusions. And what wrong conclusions would that be? Let me explain. If it all really goes back to the totally wrong and misleading GBC report of the May 28th meeting. In July, when Tamal walked out of Prabhupada's room with the signed copy of the July 9th letter, he understood at that time that this letter documented the system that Srila Prabhupada wanted in place for after he departs. So the conclusion was shared, that conclusion was shared by both Tamal and Gauridas Pandit, who is the only other devotee in the room with Tamal, and Srila Prabhupada, with Srila Prabhupada, as the letter was being dictated. So Tamal shared that view with Jasodanandan and other leading men at the time. And as we see, right up to the July 21st, Rameshwar was just ready to send this letter out to all the temple presidents, and something changed his mind at the last minute. Recall what I said about the official GBC report of the May 28th meeting? That report was the only information the GBC members had for determining what system Srila Prabhupada wanted in place for after he departs. Since the May 28th meeting, the only information that Rameshwar and the other GBC members knew about what Srila Prabhupada had, well, at least supposedly said. So in essence, that report stated, Srila Prabhupada will appoint several devotees who shall perform initiation after his disappearance. The disciples they accept will be theirs. This was the only thing the rest of the GBC were anticipating after May 28th. Obviously, at least a number of the leading GBC men were anxiously waiting for Prabhupada to make his selection, because whoever he names, they will become the next acharyas in our disciplic line. At least that's what the members of the GBC were thinking Srila Prabhupada had said, because that's what the GBC report said he had said. So when Rameshwar wrote the letter to the GBC, it was on the 21st of July. He most likely had the July 9th letter for only a day or two before, because as I've shown in the previous timelines, Jasodanandan had seen Tamal going back to Prabhupada's room in the evening of the 9th And then the next morning, on the 10th, he saw Tamal had the signed letter with Prabhupada's signature. So that means the letter probably wasn't mailed out from Vrindavan until the 11th or 12th or so. It would take about a week to reach America, which be put it around the 19th, 20th, who knows how long it took him to mail it and how long the letters took. So he probably didn't have that much time after he got the letter until he wrote the July 21st letter to the GBC. He probably didn't have that July 9th letter that much time. And so it was just starting to soak in as he was reading it, what this really meant. And he thought, he was excited because his name is on the list. He made the grade. Srila Prabhupada has only selected 11 disciples, and Rameshwar, his name is one of them. This means he is going to become one of the next acharyas in our line. He will soon be sitting on a Vyasa-san, and he'll have hundreds of disciples, thousands of disciples worshiping his feet. But just before he sends out copies of this July 9th letter, wait, Rameshwar notices a huge problem. This letter only describes the men that Srila Prabhupada had selected as being Ritvik priests only, who only conduct the process of initiation on Prabhupada's behalf, where Prabhupada remained the actual guru. What? Rameshwar thinks that, this is not good. This is not good at all. Srila Prabhupada's health is crucial. He could leave this world at any moment. If Rameshwar sends this letter out to all the temple presidents and they share it with all the rank and file members, and then Srila Prabhupada leaves, everyone will be totally misled. They'll be thinking that these men are the only to be Ritviks. The only thing the GBC can do is show them the GBC report. They didn't have anything from Srila Prabhupada in writing. So why will devotees accept these men as actual gurus? When the letter, the only thing that's written with Srila Prabhupada's signature on it is he said they're going to be Ritviks. Rameshwar must have thought that Prabhupada just wasn't thinking right, or whatever he thought. For whatever reason, Rameshwar decided, and I'm saying Rameshwar, as I said, this is a bit speculative. I don't have absolute proof, but it makes logical sense. It could have been one of the other GBC members. Okay, it could have been Tamal, and then he called Rameshwar. It could have been any of the other 11 who, got that July 9th letter. But of course, the only ones that had seen it at this time were Rameshwar and Tamal, because Rameshwar had just now sending the letter out to the other GBC members. So really, it was either Rameshwar or Tamal, and I'm pretty sure it was Rameshwar. So I'm just saying this. It is speculative, but all the evidence points to that. So for whatever reason, Rameshwar then decided that in order for these men to be accepted as gurus, which Rameshwar is convinced is what Srila Prabhupada really wanted, because that's what the flawed GBC report said. So he's thinking that, it would be best if devotees just don't have access or see this July 9th letter, because it's just going to confuse everyone. Devotees will refuse to accept them as actual gurus when Prabhupada leaves, because all they're going to have is this letter that says they're appointed as Ritviks. So he was thinking this would just become a big mess. And in order to avoid such a mess and make it easier for them to manage and take up the role of becoming gurus, Rameshwar decided just not to send the letter out to the temple presidents. At some point, he would have had, to contact Tamal and run this by him. And when Tamal came out of the meetings with Srila Prabhupada with the signed letter in hand, he had told Jasonandan that this Ritvik system was what Prabhupada wanted for after release. And that, of course, is what Gauridas Pandit understood as well. But when Rameshwar, would have contacted him and told him, his plan not to send out the letter, and told him why, most likely Rameshwar convinced Tamal, based on that May 28th GBC, record of the GBC, the record of the May 28th meeting, that Srila Prabhupada had said they were going to be regular gurus, and that's not what it says in this letter. And he must have convinced Tamal that he must have misunderstood as he was getting the letter dictated from Prabhupada, that he misunderstood what really, and it's just only for what Prabhupada is present. And it could not apply to after Prabhupada leaves. And so somehow or other, Tamal became convinced, because he was already convinced. Tamal was already convinced that's what Prabhupada wanted, because he stood up for that. When Satsarup had approached him to ask to have something done in writing, so go back to Srila Prabhupada and have it done in writing, have him write something, sign something, stating that the people who he's going to name will become regular gurus. And Tamal refused, because he was so adamant that he clearly understood what the GBC port had stated. So when Rameshwar tells him, no, you must have gotten it wrong on July 7th, 8th, and 9th, when Prabhupada was dictating this letter, and Tamal must have just, I must have. And what that means is that Tamal was mistaken one way or the other. He was either mistaken about what he had thought Srila Prabhupada had said on May 28th, meaning he was wrong about Prabhupada's, when Prabhupada said that he would soon select men who will be regular gurus. Tamal was either mistaken about that, or he was mistaken about what Srila Prabhupada said while he was dictating the July 9th letter. And, one way or the other, he was mistaken. So he might as well pick the side where he becomes the actual guru, right? That probably influenced him to accept that he was mistaken about the July 9th letter. Because if he's mistaken about that, well, then he'll become an actual guru. So anyway, I'm just going to throw that out. It's purely speculative. But note in Jasodanandan's diary for July 10th, when Tamal comes out of Prabhupada's room and shows Jasu the letter, he tells Jasu that, Jasu asks, Jasodanandan Swami asks, what does this all mean? And Tamal Krishna says that devotees have been writing to Prabhupada asking for initiations, and now Prabhupada has named the 11 Ritviks. They can initiate on his who can initiate on his behalf, and he said others can be added. Jasodanandan asked, and when Prabhupada departs, Tamal says, there'll be Ritviks. That's what Prabhupada said. It's all on tape. So, as I said, that all on tape is something Gauridas Pandit has said for past 4 decades, as I have already mentioned this, because he was the one, his duty was to hit the record button and make sure the tapes were being recorded. So he says he knows there were multiple meetings and they all had tapes. So where are those tapes? And that's been a big question. Tamal Krishna, and I'm just going to throw this out there, because a lot of devotees have pointed to Tamal, since it was his service to mail those tapes to the Bhaktivedanta Tape Ministry, which was also located at the Los Angeles Temple. So a number of devotees, including Gauridas Pandit, have at times assumed that it must have been Tamal who did something with those tapes. But I'm just going to throw this out, because I just thought of it now as I'm recording the video, and that Tamal was going to had to mail the July 9th letter. He had to mail the actual original letter to Rameshwar on July 9th. Well, we know it was July 10th that he got the signature of the letter. So he was going to mail it on July 10th, 11th, 12th, sometime he was going to mail this letter, and he had the tapes from those meetings that Rameshwar is in Los Angeles, the tape ministry in Los Angeles. It could very well be that mailed the tapes to Rameshwar, so it was just one package. He mailed the tapes and the letter together in one package. It's just a little bit speculative, but it's a possibility. So instead of Tamal being responsible to what happened to these tapes, could have been Rameshwar. Since he's still around, we need to ask him. And if if he knows what happened to those tapes, if he got them or not. And it makes a little sense, because that way they're both in Los Angeles. That way Tamal would only have to mail one thing out instead of 2 things, go to the post office and make one trip, just one package, be done with it. So We don't know if those tapes are still existent, if they got hidden somewhere, or if they were destroyed. I mean, if Rameshwar is thinking that this letter was such a bad idea that it shouldn't be sent out because devotees might get misled, might he have also thought about the same thing about the tapes as well? Anyway, it's speculative. So that's all I'll say on it for right now. But let's go back to what I was saying, that it was either Rameshwar or one of the other GBC, probably Rameshwar or Tamal, who decided that this letter would create confusion, that it would mislead devotees into reaching the wrong conclusion. So what did it also mean not to send this letter out to the temple presidents? What it means that those GBC men who decided not to send it were deciding to disobey Srila Prabhupada's order, because Srila Prabhupada had requested that this letter be sent to the temple presidents. So this act of not sending out the letter was also an act of disobedience to Srila Prabhupada. What they were thinking is that it was Srila Prabhupada and his letter, his instructions in that letter, that would mislead all of the devotees. What was really misleading, who really misled us, was these men's disobedience to Srila Prabhupada. That is what really misled all of us. What really misled us is these GBC's men, the GBC men's thinking that Srila Prabhupada's letter would mislead us. They're thinking that Prabhupada's letter was going to mislead us. That is what misled us. Their thinking, their actions. Instead of going back to Srila Prabhupada and asking him to sign a written statement that he wanted that these men become the actual gurus on his disappearance, instead they decided to handle this themselves. They thought the best way to handle this is just by disobeying Srila Prabhupada and just keep this letter to themselves and not send it out. I mean, that's actually what and they decided that that would be better for ISKCON, to disobey Prabhupada and keep his instructions, keep devotees from reading what he wrote. That would be better. That's going to keep ISKCON together. And that's the same exact thing that Rameshwar told me why he decided not to let devotees know what Srila Prabhupada's request was in October of 1977, when Prabhupada requested all his disciples to come and be by his side in Vrindavan. Rameshwar thought Prabhupada's request will wind up destroying ISKCON, and so he had to take whatever action he had to do to save ISKCON, which meant he had to keep Prabhupada's last request from being known, and he had to lie to all the devotees and tell all of us just the opposite of what Prabhupada said. And that was just to save us from Prabhupada, because he was convinced Prabhupada's request, Prabhupada's words, Prabhupada's request was going to destroy ISKCON. And just see how, for this letter, they're thinking that it's Srila Prabhupada's request, Srila Prabhupada's instructions, Srila Prabhupada's letter that will mislead us and could wind up totally messing up ISKCON. These men had decided it would be better for ISKCON to prevent us from reading the letter on this most important topic that His Divine Grace wanted us to read. And in March of 1978, when the GBC rolled out the 11 new acharyas and their brand spanking new multi-guru system, they only informed us that Srila Prabhupada had given a list with the 11 names on it, and that he had stated in that list or that paper the same as he had said when the GBC met with him in May of 1977, that these men would act as Ritviks while he was present and would become actual gurus after he departs on his disappearance. They could say things like that because none of us had access to that letter to see for ourselves. What really bothers a lot of us, because we gave our lives to Srila Prabhupada and his mission also, is that these GBC men were keeping all knowledge about what Srila Prabhupada wanted regarding future for gurus, initiations, etc. They were keeping all that information to themselves, and were not sharing that information with the rest of us. Since May of 1977, the GBC, at least they thought they knew, that Srila Prabhupada would select men who would become the next gurus. But they didn't share that information with even the temple presidents. Then in July, they decided that the 11 men listed in this letter were to become gurus when Srila Prabhupada departs. And again, they came to that conclusion, but they didn't share that with anyone outside of the GBC. They didn't share any knowledge about any of this with the rest of Prabhupada's disciples. They wait until Srila Prabhupada has already left this world, and then in March, three and a half months after he departs, in March of 1978, they just spring it on all of us. Surprise, everyone. Guess who Prabhupada selected as the next acharyas? He selected us. Oh, he did that back in July. We just didn't think you needed to know this until now, months after he left. And even then, in March of 1978, they still refused to share this letter with us. Instead, they would wind up banning all of Srila Prabhupada's letters. And their very act of deciding not to send this letter to the temple presidents was nothing less than their blatant disobedience to Srila Prabhupada. That is how these men dealt with this issue as it was unfolding in 1977 and for many years later. And yet they have had the audacity to declare those who support the Ritvik Ras path as being fallen and disrespectful of their leadership and decisions on this matter. When we learn the real facts of what really took place, the GBC has been the ones who were disrespecting Srila Prabhupada's leadership and his instructions. Just so you get the real sense of how bad their actions were, let me review again the situation and circumstances of Srila Prabhupada's authoring this letter. By July, Srila Prabhupada was extremely weak. From the audio recording that was made on the 7th of July, we can hear he takes long pauses, is coughing up phlegm. He's simply just very weak. From a search of the database, we find that for the entire month of June in 1977, Srila Prabhupada signed only one letter, and that was to Ambarish Das Prabhu. In the month of July, he signed only 2 letters. The first was a letter to the postmaster in Vrindavan dated July 4th, in which Srila Prabhupada gave his signature authorizing Tamal Krishna to accept all letters, parcels, and money orders that were sent to Srila Prabhupada. And the second letter that he signed in July was this July 9th letter. And in the month of August, there is only one letter that Srila Prabhupada signed, and that was to the U.S. Embassy as Srila Prabhupada was preparing to make a trip back to the U.S. As we can see, he was only signing the most important correspondence needed. There were other letters that Srila Prabhupada had asked Tamal to write, and Srila Prabhupada, but Srila Prabhupada didn't sign them. But the letters I just mentioned were the only ones that Srila Prabhupada signed during that period. And as I've made a point to document, he spent a number of days and many meetings with Tamal Krishna as he very carefully crafted this letter such that it stated exactly what he wanted it to. Considering the seriousness of his health and condition, we must give consideration to the time and effort that Srila Prabhupada made to have this letter written. And, very important to note, this letter contained the exact information about this issue that Srila Prabhupada himself wanted that the temple presidents, he wanted them to know and understand the information, the instructions that he gave in this letter at that time in July of 1977. That is important to take note of. The information in this letter that His Divine Grace spent days on to make sure it stated exactly what he wanted it to state. He did this over many meetings to assure that this is what he wanted the GBC and temple presidents to know. This letter appeared so bad to these GBC men that they decided that no one outside of the GBC should be allowed to see it in order to protect the movement from being misled by Srila Prabhupada. I mean, that's what the facts tell us. That is why they banned, they first of all did not send the letter out. They decided to keep it to themselves. And then later they just banned all of Srila Prabhupada's letters. And here's the point, because they did it because the May 28th meeting was wrong. But even though that was wrong, it did not, they misunderstood it. But that does not give them the right to ban Srila Prabhupada's instructions. And that act by itself was a big red flag. They should have understood this is wrong. What we're doing is wrong. Prabhupada wrote this letter. This is what he wanted everyone to read. Why would it be banned? Why are we banning it? Hey, we need to go to Prabhupada and straighten this out. Instead, they thought they'll just handle it themselves. And how are they going to handle it? We'll just ban what Prabhupada said. We just won't let devotees know what he said. It came to, in March, where they wrote this paper, and we'll just say that he said the same thing in that letter as he said in the May 28th meeting, that these men were going to become regular gurus. He didn't say that in the May 28th meeting. That was a wrong. The GBC report was wrong. But he did not say that in this letter. And they just made that up. They wanted to convince us that their understanding was the right understanding. They wanted us to understand that because that's what they understood. And it was all based on a false and wrong pretense. But still, it doesn't let them off the hook for disobeying Srila Prabhupada's request to send this letter out. They had committed a great offense by such thinking that Prabhupada's letter would mislead us. And then their actions amounted to, it was just a direct, blatant disobedience to Srila Prabhupada, to his request. So I ask, who misled who? These GBC men were convinced that it was Srila Prabhupada and his incomplete, they thought his letter was incomplete, letter that would mislead us all. Because it didn't state that they're totally wrong and led understanding was that Prabhupada was going to name these men to be gurus, so it didn't state that. But who was misleading who? The fact that these men came to that conclusion back in 1977 tells us a lot about their characters and their ability, or lack of it, to make the best decisions on such critical matters. It was one thing that the May 28th report was so wrong, but their decision to keep this letter from the rest of the devotees, to disobey Srila Prabhupada, that stands by itself as a whole separate failure. When we look at all these issues and analyze them, it was the GBC men who were reaching the wrong conclusions and making one wrong decision after the other on this issue. And why would that be? Well, Tamal Krishna once admitted in 1980 at the Topanga Canyon meeting that he had strong desires to want to lord it over and control others. He had strong desires to want to be in charge. And so did Rameshwar, and so did Hamsaduta, Kirtanananda, etc. They had such strong mundane desires to want to be guru for all the wrong mundane reasons that those strong desires kept clouding their thinking and made them reach all the wrong conclusions, one time after the other, and make all wrong decisions when it came to this Ritvik Guru issue. Actually, from my personal experience, I made an ancillary note regarding Tamal, what I call Tamal's plan to take over ISKCON. I put that as a separate ancillary note, and I'll relate to you what I knew of that plan and what I knew of it back in 1975 or 76, whenever it took place. Anyway, where he wanted to basically take over ISKCON. You can watch that if you want. It's a separate ancillary note. It's not really important to understanding this issue, but it's just to understand a little bit about who these people, what their really motive was. I mean, because that Tamal himself admitted that that was his strong desire at that time. He admitted that in 1980. They had that strong desire to want to control others. And so he wanted to be a big, big guru. And this is what clouded their thinking. It clouded their thinking on May 28th when they met with Srila Prabhupada, and Prabhupada's talking about Ridvik, and then he talks about on my order be actual guru, and they just put it all together. Oh, he's going to name, the people he's going to name are going to be regular guru. And then when the Prabhupada came out with the July 9th letter, they're like, oh, this is bad. This is really bad. We can't let devotees see this, because Prabhupada, for some reason, he didn't put down that we're going to be regular gurus. Instead of going back to Prabhupada, asking him to sign something to that effect, they just thought they'll handle it themselves. And they handled it, and by handling it, they decided they'll disobey Prabhupada. They'll disobey his instruction, and they won't send this letter out, and they'll ban Prabhupada's instruction because they saw Prabhupada's letter as being destructive to ISKCON. And that's the basis. These are the men who made these decisions to started taking us down this multi-guru path. That was their mentality. That's the way they justified things. And that's what they were willing to do, to disobey Srila Prabhupada, to put forward what they thought, instead of just going back to Prabhupada and asking him. And these are the men who took us down the wrong path. And that's what I was wanting to point out here. But it's just to give an idea of what the character of these men was like. And that's why so many of us knew they weren't qualified to become gurus when Prabhupada left or afterwards. Prabhupada never ordered them because they weren't qualified.